Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today we're going to look at what was called the peculiar institution in antebellum America, but ultimately we're going to look at slavery and its role in antebellum society. Hopefully it dispels some of the myths surrounding slavery as well, but also acknowledging all the people who also work towards the ending of that institution. So abolition in the early republic, so the period of the revolution and the 20 years following, slavery was a political issue then, but on a much smaller scale. So within a few states during the revolution, like Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New York, you did find some enslaved men who fought for the Americans during the Revolutionary War, and as a result gained their freedom. Due to that. We also will see that the British will try to utilize enslaved populations in places like Virginia by promising freedom to them. They will fight for the British, but the British don't secure the win, and so that promise is never honored. We also see that there is the beginning of manumission laws. So there's a very short window of time in the legal code of what were known as slave states, where a person who owned slaves was able to free their property. They could hire an attorney, and through writing of a will or issuing some contract that ended the terms of enslavement. This will all be phased out by the early 1830s. And some states, like South Carolina, will never actually have manumission. Most southern states in particular will require over time that the only way to free one's slaves is to actually get a private bill that is created by the state legislature. So particularly in slave states in the South, you see very few people ever earning their freedom within their own lifetime. We're also going to see the establishment of certain churches. The Quaker Church, since their inception in the 1600s, but certainly the Methodist Church, which gains followers during the First Great Awakening and also during the Second Great Awakening. These are both going to be churches that do not believe that Christian people can own slaves, and therefore they're going to articulate through their religious services and other teachings the abolition of slavery. And certainly within a few years after the American Revolution, just before the writing of the Constitution, there are going to be a couple of states like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts that will outright abolish slavery, and other northern states will over time create emancipation. Some not until the 1820s, but this is a process that's going to begin in northern states just following the American Revolution. So it's important to note that when we speak about slavery in the antebellum era, that we're speaking about the fact that slavery is going to expand geographically. It's going to expand in terms of its numbers demographically, and also its role economically. All of these things are expanding in the antebellum period. So we're not seeing less and less slavery over time, even though we have entire states that are going to abolish the institution of slavery, because it's going to continue to thrive in other areas and spread west. And that is very closely intertwined to what becomes the cotton economy that dominates the market revolution in antebellum America. So we are going to see a couple of things all happen in tandem, which ultimately will lead to this cotton-based economy. The first is the technology. Prior to the 1790s, cotton is a much thinner, finer fiber than something like wool. It's not easily hand woven. It also is not easily carded or cleaned. And so it's going to be inventions like the cotton gin, the spinning jenny, the basic mechanized weaving machines that make it possible to use cotton for textiles and use it so it's an economic alternative. Also, there's hybridization of the cotton plant itself. So long staple cotton, much longer fibers, a finer product is produced, but it is not really suitable for one, drought areas, so it's not particularly drought resistant. And it's also, for the machinery of the time, you needed just a thicker, more stable product. And so through hybridization, we see the development of something called short staple cotton. So we have the technology, we have short staple cotton, and together we are going to see a whole new economy come to dominate American life. It's important to realize that in the South and the North, they are intertwined in this economy. The South may be the place where we see enslaved labor in the production of cotton, but these northern mills, these textile mills, that are going to be producing low-cost cloth. It is going to be because there is so much unpaid labor that is responsible for the production of this plant. By the 1860s, 75% of the world's cotton is going to be produced in the American South, and is going to be produced as a product of about 4.5 million people living in slavery. So we are also seeing an internal slave trade gain rise. We no longer have the international slave trade, but in areas where there were larger slave populations at the turn of the 19th century, we are going to see those people begin to be sold off for cotton production further south and west. We're also seeing what was called natural increase, meaning that enslaved people having children. And so the slave population is ever growing and is continuing to move westward. The Southern economy will never really develop the diversity that we will see in the Northern economy. So there are factory systems being built across the Northwest, but we're also going to see a continuation of agricultural production and things like staple crops. The South had creeks and rivers. They could have built factories, but chose not, because those who had capital, had the liquidity, the money to invest, chose to invest in what they saw as the more profitable, which was the agricultural production of cotton, not the production of textiles. So we're going to see little infrastructure, little transportation being built in the South as well, because there's no investment in those things as tied to the factory system. Our image here is just to give you a sense of one, the ever increasing population of enslaved people, but also how that is running parallel to the increased production of cotton. So up through 1820, there's relatively little cotton being produced in the American South, but we are going to see that the population of enslaved people basically grow by about 1 million people every 20 years, and that cotton production is going to increase exponentially due to it. Also, the nature of enslaved labor will change. So during the colonial period, the period before we see large-scale cotton production, we do see that in the Caribbean, there is what's known as the gang labor system, where enslaved people are held accountable for their level of productivity on a daily basis and face very extreme consequences if they cannot meet those quotas. That was not true for slavery through most of what was British colonial America. At one time, enslaved laborers did a multitude of tasks. They were likely to also be trained in more specialized tasks like blacksmithing or carpentry. But as cotton production takes over, we are going to see that slave labor is ever more directed to that purpose. And so we will see that also skilled labor on the part of enslaved people will also decline. And in a sense, what will become skilled laborers are typically white laborers. So we're going to see the nature of work itself change. Cotton is going to spread west. There's not enough available arable land in what is the original 13 states. And so with the acquisition of things like the Louisiana Purchase, later the colonization of Texas, we're seeing people who own slavery, people who are directing their economic interest towards cotton production, desperately wanting land in the West. It's going to create all kinds of ecological problems simply because the soil was drained quite rapidly of nutrients from the production of cotton. There were limits in terms of pesticides and soil nutrients. And so as time goes on, people who grow cotton need more land in the West to continue to be productive. We're also going to see that there's going to be some political issues that come from this as well. As urban populations in the North increase, in part because of things like immigration, we are going to see in the South a desperate need to continue to add pro-slavery states to the Union, simply because even though the House of Representatives, which is based on population, may favor the North, while we add slave states, every new slave state creates 2 new senators who are in favor of the continued expansion of slavery across America. So our images here are just so you can compare 1820 to 1860, and you can see that the slave population and areas of cotton production essentially run together. And again, it's mostly confined to the southeastern portions of the United States. But by the time we get to 1860, we're seeing cotton production stretch clear across the American South, well into Texas, and we're seeing a concentration of enslaved labor used specifically for cotton production. We also can see, if you look at the portions that are in white here of northern Georgia, western North Carolina, northern Alabama, these were all Indian lands, the 5 civilized tribes, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Cherokee would have occupied these lands in 1820. Their removal in the 1830s makes it possible for the way you see land usage by 1860. So Indian removal is also tied very closely to the interests of cotton producers and slave owners wanting to move west. But so you can visualize here, by 1860, we clearly have areas of the country that are free states. Slavery is not allowed to exist there. The former 5 states that become known as the former Old West Territory, right? That was all created to be a place where slavery would not expand, and other slaves or other states in the Northeast will also then become free states as well. But we're seeing a concentration of enslaved people in the American South. And what is in blue here on my screen are areas in which the U.S. government at the national level, Congress by 1850, is going to choose that in these new territories, they don't want to have to draw lines on maps. They don't want to have to make direct decisions about whether states are slave states or free states. And so they are going to create the notion of popular sovereignty, that if I and enough people who think like me come to form a new state, that we're going to decide at that point whether we want to be a free state or a slave state. But obviously, people come and settle in these territories with their slaves or without their slaves, depending on their point of view. And so it's an issue that will give rise certainly to the American Civil War. It'll make the issue nationally of abolition far more contentious than it had in an earlier period of time. The information that's on my screen here is to demonstrate that we see 3 very distinct classes of people living in antebellum America. So a state that allowed slavery had an enslaved population, and we know 3/5 of that also counted towards what will be apportionment in Congress and the Electoral College. We will have a white population, and we also will have what's known as a free Black population. And that was a legal status for people of color who were not owned by anyone else. So you could clearly demonstrate that you were a free person under the law. Why 3 statuses? Because essentially there were 3 legal codes. There was the legal code for whites, there was the legal code or slave code that applied to anyone who was enslaved or people who owned slaves or would engage with slaves, and then a legal status for people who were free and Black. So I could be a free Black man, adult, living in New Jersey in the 1830s and would not be allowed to vote. I wouldn't have voting rights because even though it was a free state, Black men did not have a right to vote. I also would not be able to testify in court or be part of a jury. So there were essentially a different status for those people. In some areas, there were large numbers of free Black people who coexisted alongside an enslaved population, also a free white population. And in other areas like South Carolina, for instance, we are seeing something very different. First of all, half the population in South Carolina, slightly more than half, is going to be enslaved as of 1830. So the white population is actually the minority population. Also, there's very few free Black people, and that's because South Carolina did not recognize manumission. And so the vast majority of people who would have been free Black in South Carolina, either their state legislature gave permission for them to have their freedom, or they came from somewhere else. But that was a place where, especially because there was such a large enslaved population, there was a fear that an enslaved population and a free Black population together would foment rebellion, create more problems for the white power structure that existed. You can see as the country moves west, in particular a place like Alabama, Mississippi, Missouri, there are very few free Black people. Those are new states. Those are going to be states that are going to be created by people who want to move west for the purposes of cotton production, and therefore they're bringing slavery with them and want to see it remain intact as much as possible. So Southern society is really not going to change too much, except that the group that was known as the gentry of the colonial period, they'll still have a great deal of wealth, of land, but the big change will be they will have greater political control. So once we have the vacuum that is created by the British losing the American Revolution, at one time only local governments, right, were directly controlled by those living in the United States or the American colonies. But once we are an independent nation, we have states, we have a national government with representatives. And there we'll see that these landowners, these aristocratic people, essentially they own the majority of land. They also control the political power as well. And so even though over time fewer and fewer whites actually own slaves, we're going to see that those who do own large numbers of slaves, own lots of land that's being cultivated for cotton production, and therefore want to see laws at the state level, the national level even, that will promote their economic interests. So this goes to answer the question of, well, if so many whites didn't own slaves, why was slavery perpetuated for so long? If you had only a few people who were involved in political office and owned this land, how did they continuously get elected by whites who didn't own slaves? Well, it comes down to really two things. The first one is that one is aspirational. If I was poor and white, maybe I was a tenant farmer. One day I hope to own my own land. One day I hope to own my own slaves. I saw those two things as a rise in status. I may not actually ever achieve that, but I wanted the opportunity to somehow have that if possible. The other piece of it is just simply fear and social control. If I am white and poor, I at least have the right to vote. I might own some land. I, as a person, have still more rights and power than a person of color. And I'm not going to see any interest in extending what little I have politically to other people. And so the culture of the American South is going to be dominated by a few very elite, wealthy people. And we're going to see that in that time period, that the number of people who actively own slaves will certainly decrease, but the desire to maintain that institution doesn't seem to change. Perhaps in some ways it becomes more stratified. So when we speak about life under slavery, it's important to understand that as slaves become more and more profitable in terms of cotton production and this gang labor system, that the degree of brutality, certainly as it's reported and discussed, seems to increase. And in all likelihood, it's because, again, the nature of slavery changed radically. The stories of brutality that were certainly testified to during this time period are very similar to the stories that were shared about sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean in the 16s and 1700s. We're also going to see very high birth rates for enslaved populations. Again, an enslaved woman had no right to her body and no right to her children. And so whether that was raped by a white master or overseer, or being forcibly or directed to have children with another enslaved man, those children did not belong to their mother. And so typically an enslaved woman who had a child would find that child taken away from her at a pretty early age. Families were broken up and sold on. And there was great concern that slave rebellion was ever possible, especially in areas like South Carolina, where you had a much larger slave rather than free population. And so slave codes are going to become increasingly more strict in the antebellum period. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Do people resist? Absolutely. Probably running away was a way of demonstrating resistance. What was known as slow work, probably the average slave, unless facing extreme punishment, was not motivated to work at any great speed because they wouldn't personally profit from it. And certainly there might be theft or sabotage, but in all likelihood, there are other things that are going on that are really going to limit opportunities of resistance. Most slave codes, certainly by the 1830s, make it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. The vast majority of enslaved people had no literacy skill. Families were broken up. Especially adult male slaves were sold on multiple times during the course of their life. And so all the things that might make it possible to unify, to rebel in some way, to resist, are being decidedly taken away as options. And for people who were free Black, they typically lived under still some restrictions. In North Carolina by the 1830s, even if you were a free Black person, not enslaved, you still could not be legally taught to read, and there were no schools for you to attend. The picture on my screen here is a drawing attempting to convey the horror of an event known as Nat Turner's Rebellion. And this is a common type of motif that's going to be seen in newspapers, and predominantly in the South, or certainly in states where slavery is legal. And it's important to note that there are very few active, successful rebellions in the antebellum period. Really just one, Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831. However, the fear of rebellion and the fear of autonomous people of color is going to do a lot to create a hysteria that is going to encourage state houses to create more and more restrictions on enslaved people, but also make whites less and less likely to support abolition. There was a great fear amongst white populations that if abolition should ever come, especially to these states with large slave populations, that you would literally see uprisings, bloodshed. So the culture is directed towards keeping slavery at any cost. Two conspiracies that will encourage these beliefs. And again, I use the word conspiracy because there's no direct evidence that the people that these conspiracies or these rebellions are named after actually actively engaged in rebellion, but simply by the fact that they had certain attributes and experiences that might make it possible for them to be leaders of rebellion. They still found themselves being tried and executed for a leading rebellion. Gabriel Prosser was an enslaved man who was a very gifted blacksmith living in the Richmond, Virginia area. And in 1800, 4 enslaved people came forward to their master saying that there were a cache of weapons on the property that had been created by Gabriel Prosser, and he was helping plan a rebellion in the Richmond area. So how would someone like Gabriel be able to potentially do this? Well, he could read and write. As someone who had skills, his master hired him out. He was well traveled, he had freedom of movement. And as a blacksmith, he made tools, he made weapons, he probably even did a little gunsmithing from time to time. And so it was possible that someone like Gabriel Prosser could lead a rebellion. Um, but by finding the weapons, having slaves come forth saying that there was potential rebellion, this is what made Gabriel a target. In all likelihood, he probably has some connection to what was going to happen. But there were people who betrayed him. Why did they choose to do that? Well, maybe they actually knew about a plot to overthrow and rebel against the white population. It also may have been that somebody else had been responsible, but they were afraid that they would be found out or caught. They didn't want to face the consequences of that. Gabriel Prosser is executed, so are 30 other slaves who are living on plantations where other groups of tools or weapons are found. Understand that an enslaved person would not have had tools in their own home cabin that they lived in. They would have essentially reported for work each morning, been given the tool that was required, and they were having to return it before they could be dismissed for the day. So the idea that you could find a cache of tools even might be seen as the attempts for rebellion. 20 years later, a similar circumstance happened with a man named Denmark Vesey, who was a free man. He'd been raised in slavery, bought his own freedom in his late 20s. He was someone who had worked as on a crew for a ship. He was very familiar with shipping, and he eventually, as a free person, moved to Charleston to basically create a business for himself, and became quite successful. Was able to raise and personally donate money in order to create the first AME Zion church. And this was a church for African American people in South Carolina. And again, as someone who had some freedom, he could read and write. He actually had a successful business, and he made it possible for African Americans, both free and enslaved, to assemble on a weekly basis. He is implicated in a potential rebellion. 1822 was the year of the third rebellion in as many years in what is Dominican Republic today. And there was real fear across the United States where there was slavery that a similar thing could happen. And again, he was accused of having been somehow tied to potential rebellion. In his personal belonging, his letters, certainly know he knew about these rebellions. He did write to other people, but this was pretty common knowledge. So it wasn't as though he was writing or receiving information about anything that was secretive. But for the fact that he had this much power, in a time when Black men did not, he found himself easily a scapegoat. The Vesey insurrection, as you can see from our newspaper article here, becomes sensationalized. There's books and pamphlets written about it. Again, no proof. But Denmark Vesey, along with nearly 100 people, will be publicly executed. The church he built burned down. And much like what was going on in Virginia, you're going to see the slave code become ever more restrictive on enslaved people. So the one successful rebellion is Nat Turner's rebellion. Nat Turner was literate, like our other two leaders, but he will actively engage in a rebellion, successfully doing what he intended, which is to create some freedom for himself and some others, even only temporarily. And as a byproduct of that, killing at least 55 whites amongst 4 farms in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831. He is enslaved, but he is someone who takes on a role of basically a preacher. He had no formal ministerial training, but he was someone who, along with his white master, would go from farm to farm and providing scripture, which was important for many Southerners. They liked the idea that Christianizing enslaved people would somehow make them more docile. less likely to be violent, sort of the New Testament idea of turning the other cheek. In fact, Nat Turner was very much Old Testament in the way that he spoke to his audience. He believed that God did speak to him as he spoke to other prophets. We are not sure if Nat Turner had something like epilepsy, and because he would have periods of time where he would writhe, he would black out. But he was convinced that God would send him messages. And over the course of 2 years, he saw these messages. They were in solar and lunar eclipses. And with his followers, upon seeing the third sign, he engaged in this rebellion in 1831. He and his co-conspirators not only killed 55 people, but they're on the run for 2 months. And this sends a chill across the entire slave-owning population, or those who live amongst enslaved people in the American South. In particular, when he is caught, he is willing to testify and explain in great detail how he did what he did. We get a nationwide manhunt in order to capture him. But this is really going to, at least in slave-owning states, be the final set of restrictions, not only amongst enslaved people, but also free people of color. There is great fear that once Nat Turner does what he does, that it can be repeated, and perhaps on a much larger scale. It's important to note that Nat Turner gave a lot of evidence that essentially, made him culpable of his own guilt, but he was very clear that his inspiration was one that was divine, that he was not influenced by abolitionist tracts of the time. So there were abolitionists in the North who were printing material. In 1830, a free black abolitionist named David Walker published something called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. And he looked at abolition, this defeat of slavery, in terms of the rebellion that was required for the American colonists to gain their freedom from Great Britain. So the appeal itself is written in the language of the Declaration of Independence, John Locke's ideas that a government that doesn't protect its people or violates the freedom of the individual can be overthrown legitimately. Definitely an incendiary piece of writing that Nat Turner never, as far as we know, actually read or had any contact with. But it is something that's going to further encourage free states to realize that what they are producing in terms of abolitionist tracts are infiltrating other parts of the country, but also convince white Southerners that there needs to be censorship, there needs to be restrictions. And so starting in the early 1830s, censorship of the mail, these types of articles would have been illegal to send to people. The abolitionist newspapers that will be created in this time period, all products that are illegal to have in pro-Southern states, slavery states. So I want abolition in your mind to be thought of in two ways. So particularly in the time following the American Revolution through about 1830, there is this idea of gradualism that prevails. And gradualism is this idea that I can't probably make somebody today who owns slaves give up slavery. But 2 or 3 generations on, I might be. That slavery will be phased out over time. Thomas Jefferson's idea of creating that Northwest Ordinance, this territory where there will be no slavery, and that over time slavery will gradually fade away, that somehow technology will end slavery, right? That was kind of the purpose behind the cotton gin. Gradualism is not a reality, it's magical thinking. And the American Colonization Society was another form of gradualism. It was a group that was founded in 1816 by both white and free black leaders. Henry Clay, the author of The American System, Robert Finley and Paul Cuffey were free black merchants living in the North. And it was based on the premise that even if there was true abolition of slavery, that Black Americans would not be able to thrive or coexist with any notion of equality amongst whites. There was too much prejudice. And so the ACS created a foundation, money that they used to buy land, creating this place called Liberia off the west coast of Africa, and they would give grants. That is not a typo. They were in business for more than 150 years. But you could apply, get a grant that would help pay for your passage, entitle you to some land, tools, seed, and other things needed to get started. The first decade saw a significant number of people, a little more than 10,000 will go just in that first decade. But for many of the people that went, they found great challenges to being there, including language. Many of them were urban, free Black people, and so they had very little or no experience with agriculture. And also, there was this idea amongst the free Black population, particularly in the North, that their ancestors had been forcibly migrated to the Americas. Why should they have to leave? If the promise of America is freedom and liberty, that we're trying to create a more perfect union, why can't they be part of that as well? And so by the 1830s, the ACS is not going to have the kind of influence that it did for a short period of time. What we will see by 1830 is the emergence of what we call immediate abolition. And immediate abolition was based on the idea that you had to do three things. And if you did these three things, they called their three-pronged approach, you would ultimately defeat the forces of slavery. The first one was that you had to engage white audiences in the North, and you were going to do that through their churches because there was significant church participation, and also exposure to testimonials. And these would be stories by African Americans who had directly experienced slavery. The second piece was acknowledging that the law as it was promoted slavery. There was a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. By 1850, there'll be a Fugitive Slave Act, which made whites legally responsible if they didn't turn in runaways or if they gave aid to fugitive slaves. So there is this movement within the immediate abolitionist circle to acknowledge the fact that you may have to engage in activities that may be illegal but are moral, and that just because something is legal doesn't make it moral. And that was important for them, that they wanted to be able to, and certainly Henry David Thoreau on civil disobedience speaks to this, but the idea is that the law itself at times is immoral, and the only moral action is to actually work against the law. So the informal Underground Railroad, and certainly we call it the Underground Railroad, it was essentially a series of safe houses, guides, people who were willing to give aid to fugitive slaves as they tried to make their way out of the South. And for many of those people, they will be coming from places like Kentucky and Virginia. They have to cross the Ohio River. Just because you got to a free state did not make you free. It never did. It maybe made it more challenging for a slave catcher to take you back into slavery. But most fugitive slaves lived in fear of recapture throughout their lives. You essentially had to leave the country to guarantee your freedom. But we can see with the Underground Railroad, this picture in our lower right-hand corner here, these stairs going down, you see there's a shelf, and this shelf actually folds back into the wall, and there's actually a little space, basically for the size of a grown man, maybe a child. Not intended for a long-term stay, but if you were being hunted by slave catchers, it might give you a few hours rest. It might be a place that you could sleep before you continue to make your journey. And there are literally hundreds of these that are built between the 1830s and the early 1860s. Most of them on the northern side of the Ohio River, but certainly, especially by Quakers and Methodists in sites, particularly in the northern slave states, we will see that there is a network. Harriet Tubman is a real person. She escaped from slavery herself. She goes back dozens of times to bring other people, guide them to freedom. And then the third piece of this is that abolition has to become politically active. and therefore has to engage with members of Congress and has to make abolition a national issue, because the states that have decided to abolish slavery, they've already done that. So now we need the national government to stop the spread of slavery west and perhaps even eradicate slavery where it currently exists. This political campaign, signing petitions, writing congressmen, is going to be effective to such a degree that by 1836, where pro-slavery members of the House of Representatives have some power, they are able to institute something called a gag rule, which they renew every 2 years until 1844, when they no longer control the House of Representatives. But this was great inroads by abolitionists. They were able to show that they could unnerve and strategically try to control the conversation. And certainly there's a lot more discussion about slavery after 1844 when this gag rule ends. So when we speak about abolitionists, we speak about reformers. There are 5 that I want to talk about. They are both white and African American, and they are going to do different things to try to shape the abolition movement. And they are all what we would call immediate abolitionists. They are also people who are guided by the principle that not only is slavery going to be abolished, but when it is, there has to also be an extension of equality as well. William Lloyd Garrison was a white abolitionist. In his early 20s, actually involved with the American Colonization Society, but came quickly to realize that it was limited. Also, that many of the white abolitionists he dealt with were people who agreed with abolition, but didn't agree with equality. And so he was seen as quite a radical for his day, but he believed that he needed to create something. He needed to look at the mass media, how it was being used in lots of other ways in this time period, and direct this towards the message of abolition. So starting in 1831, he creates a weekly newspaper called The Liberator. The Liberator has both a national and international audience, and in a sense, it's a primer. So every edition of The Liberator is going to tell me about the political work that's being done at the state and national level. I'm going to get testimonies of enslaved people, or former enslaved people. I'm also going to find out places where I can go and meet with fellow abolitionists, when there's going to be conferences. And so it was literally the newspaper of abolition. He will print it every week until the 13th Amendment is ratified in 1865. As an immediate abolitionist in the early 1830s especially, even in Boston, he faced violence. People attempted to burn down his house, break up his printing press. He was physically attacked, had his arm broken, his face punched in. Even in Boston, where there had not been legal slavery since 1784, he still faced people's wrath. There were people living in the North who didn't want to see abolition, and certainly not immediate abolition. They had their own concerns about the freedom of so many millions of people. He also went on to create something called the American Anti-Slavery Society. It was important to him to have an organization that included men and women. He believed that having separate institutions based on gender didn't necessarily help the movement. And he felt some of the best organizers and speakers were also women, and so he wanted to encourage both sexes to work together. Another white reformer who is going to use the media of the time in order to shape how whites perceive slavery is a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. And if that name sounds familiar, we learned a little bit earlier, her father, Lyman Beecher, was a preacher during the Second Great Awakening. He was a temperance advocate, an abolitionist. Actually, all of her siblings were reformers and all abolitionists. She had been a writer. It was a way she made supplemental income for her family as a novelist. But she decided in 1851, after a trip to Kentucky, where she met some enslaved people, she actually visited some plantations, that she was going to write a novel in which all of the heroes were enslaved people. And the villains were white. They were the slave masters, the owners, the overseers. And she believed that this was going to help white audiences who might be resistant to going to see a testimonial or engaging in the literature of the abolition to have something that essentially is a form of entertainment, but be connected and begin to empathize with the characters. No one had published a book like this up to that time. It will be one of the best-selling novels in American history. She will also use a lot of allegory and imagery from the Christian Bible, again, as a way to kind of hooking in her audience. But she is going to make people who might in other ways be resistant to the message of abolition to be educated without realizing, and develop an empathy that's going to be needed for this movement. Three African American abolitionists that I want to focus on. The first one is Frederick Douglass, who was born in slavery, managed to escape in his early 20s, and benefited from the fact that although he was sold multiple times through the first 25 years of his life, one of his masters had a wife who taught him to read, and he always considered that a gift. He's truly one of the great speakers and writers of the 19th century, understanding not only the need to bring about abolition, but also someone who was very thoughtful about the promises of the Constitution and the power of amending and changing that document for the better. His narrative life is about his first 25 years. He speaks very plainly about being born of a slave woman, being told he always looked like his father, Captain Anthony, who was his white owner. Never acknowledged as the man's son, but he said that anyone who knew him recognized by his physical features who he also belonged to. His mother was sold off plantation when he was very young. She visited him a few times before she died when he believed he was 6. He never knew his own birth date. He was raised by an elderly enslaved woman. Starting when he was 10 years old, he began to be sold again and again, primarily because he demonstrated intelligence. He was not docile. He was willing to resist to a certain degree. His narrative life also discusses the condition upon which other slaves will live. He recounts tales of seeing an enslaved woman who was his aunt be beaten to death, and other acts of violence. These were not common topics in antebellum America that people really acknowledged. So by publishing this material and then also going on tour and giving testimonials, he was attempting to show people that it's not just simply being anti-slavery, but also demonstrating the brutality and the dehumanization that went on a daily basis for millions of people in the United States. He was a good friend of William Lloyd Garrison's, but felt that it was really important to demonstrate not only his own capacity, but the capacity for African Americans to fight for their own freedom, to demonstrate their ability intellectually to be the equals of whites. And so he went on and created his own newspaper called the North Star. And all of his authors, his editor, and he as the publisher, were all African Americans. And so that was his other contribution to this movement. Harriet Jacobs and Sojourner Truth were both African American women who will be able to speak firsthand, particularly about the sexual subjugation that is going on in the condition of slavery. Nobody really wanted to address the simple fact that the enslaved population was growing much faster than was necessarily possible from enslaved men and enslaved women choosing to procreate. That you are seeing a lot of enslaved women who are having multiple children by their masters or other white males who visited the farm, that none of these women had control of their bodies nor their children. Their children could be sold away from them. And that these two women were telling a story that was true for hundreds of thousands of enslaved women just in their own lifetime. Harriet Jacobs lived in New Bern, North Carolina. She will have two children because of the control that her slave master had over her life. She will attempt to run away, but won't go very far. She is determined to have some ability to watch her children grow up. She will actually hide in her aunt's house for nearly 8 years before she will be able to get freedom for herself and her children. Um, Harriet Jacobs was attempting to address the realities of slavery in long narrative form, much like Frederick Douglass had done nearly 15 years before. Sojourner Truth was not literate, and so she was a great public speaker. She was known for her fiery speeches, but as a public speaker, what we know of her words are basically the interpretation by her audiences, who were primarily white. Why does this matter? Because her most famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, is one in which her words are expressed with basically a Southern patois, if you will. And she was not a Southerner. She was born and raised in New York. The family was culturally Dutch and spoke Dutch. It was her first language. She actually spoke English with a slight Dutch inflection. And her words are often, I think, the product of how whites attempted to characterize her, not necessarily the true spirit of how she necessarily spoke. But she's important because she is going to be able to bring together what is this idea of women's rights and suffrage with this abolition movement. She went and first of all said that most of these abolition reform movements by women had all white membership. And they occasionally invited former enslaved women to come and speak and give testimony. But she said, we're not actually part of this. And when it comes down to it, women seeking suffrage, white women who are looking to vote and to have their own legal rights and autonomy, that this is no different than enslaved women. And that the two would be best served working together because both of them are really rights movements. And so she's kind of changing how some women look at abolition and saying it's part of a much larger issue constitutionally, legally in the United States. All of these abolitionists are people who are actively using the media of the time, the means of expression. So whether that's the public speaking of the testimony, the production of narrative works, novels, newspapers, they're all seeking to make sure that abolition is something that's part of the cultural conversation of the time. So as we close out, two things to think about. The first one is the extent to which the expansion of slavery was influenced by the market revolution, and while abolition was influenced by the Second Great Awakening. And that we can see that slavery and the economic growth that's going on in the antebellum period is being countered by these reactionary movements of the Great Awakening and the reform of abolition that comes about in the same time period. We also want to examine how the plantation slave economy and the abolitionist movements contribute to sectionalism. So as we're seeing this abolitionist movement grow in these free states across the northern portions of the United States, it is ultimately a reaction to the ever increasing plantation slave economy that is continuing to move west. And it's in that movement west that we finally see this true showdown about two different value systems in two different parts of the country colliding.